who's on chronic ventilation. Say the patient was on a ventilator in the hospital, and sometimes they cannot be taken off the ventilator. This is the patient that will usually have a permanent tracheostomy. We've even sent infants home on home ventilators and with a permanent tracheostomy because they cannot be weaned for whatever reason. If you're going to set up a ventilator in a patient's home, of course you have to make sure, first of all, that they have backup system, which is a second ventilator. They have to have a backup battery system. It usually looks like a big car battery that they put in their home. They will always have to have some kind of backup oxygenation, which is usually just an E-cylinder, because usually in the home they will either be on a liquid or a concentrator if they're requiring oxygen. If you work for a home care company, it will be your responsibility not just to set it up, to explain it to the patient, to explain it to the family or the primary caregiver, but you're going to make periodic visits to the home to make sure that everything is working properly. The LP10 is one of the more commonly used ones. Actually, this is an older version, but I find that it's very commonly used still. There are a lot of home care ventilators out there. They're coming up with new ones every day. Home care ventilators, of course, are electronically powered. In order for them to be pneumatically powered, you would have to have some kind of 50 psi gas source in the patient's home, which in most cases you will not have, so you want them to be electronically powered. It actually has an internal filter back here where it takes in room air. So obviously your patient is only getting 21% with this device. If you want them to get oxygen, if the doctor orders them to have oxygen, you can't dial in a precise FiO2 with this device. There is an oxygen accumulator that can go on the back with the air filter, or you can bleed in the oxygen the way remember the way we bled it in with the with the BiPAP. You can bleed it in that way. You'd hook it up to a floater. But then, of course, you don't know what FiO2 you're giving your patient. It requires you to put an oxygen analyzer in somewhere and to constantly monitor their saturation. Little on and off switch is right back here. Just pushes in, it powers up. The front of this thing is very, very self-explanatory. It's very easy to use. All of your parameters are inside this door. The problem is patients can't open this, or patients' family members and their caregivers. When you first turn it on, you want to have it in standby. As you can see, in standby, it's not doing really anything. And then you have your modes of ventilation. You can do assist control, which is volume. SIMV, obviously, which is volume, and it does give you the option of putting on pressure support. Or you can have the patient on pressure control. You have your volume button down here on the bottom. Besides that is your respiratory rate and your eye time. You do set an actual eye time. You do not set a flow, just the eye time.
Okay, so you said eye time and respiratory rate.
Right. And then you have, this is actually your sensitivity button, but as you can see, there are no numbers on there, so it's a way of you just have to kind of play with it to see how your patient is being ventilated. If you can tell by looking at it on the green side here, it's negative pressure, so it's pressure ventilation. On the other side, the blue side, it says positive pressure, but if that actually takes it into a flow sensitivity. And if you go too high on that positive side, it will go, so you really have to be careful when you're setting that and set it precisely. The two buttons up here are your pressure alarm buttons. You have a high pressure alarm and a low pressure alarm.
That's the only alarms?
Well, you do have a low volume alarm, but you have to go into another announcement. It can give you low volume, but it's not an alarm that you can set. It's internal.
Okay.
So the alarms are what? Again, I'm sorry.
The high.
High and low pressure.
And the low volume alarm's internal,
You have your PEEP valve on this device is external. This is actually an IPPB circuit, so don't pay that nebulizer any attention. We don't use it for anything. It's just the only circuit we had that would fit here. But your PEEP valve has to be an external PEEP valve, and it's a spring-loaded contraption that as you turn it down, you increase the pressure on
Oh,
this.
that's like the ones you put on
The manual.
the manual resuscitator,
Yeah.
right?
Right,
Yeah.
right. So if without a PEEP valve here, I can set my tidal volume. I have a tidal volume of 1,000. I have a respiratory rate of 10 breaths per minute. I have my eye time set at 1 second. Turn the sensitivity up a little bit, and then in order to turn it on, I just have to go to either assist control or SIMV. If I put my patient in assist control, it goes through the self-test as you saw. It tests its backup battery. It does have an internal backup battery, but it can also be hooked up to an external battery, which, like I say, like a big car battery, if you don't have it plugged into the wall. It should be plugged into the wall at all times, and you have to.
So there's no SST that we have to do on this
No
particular
SST.
one? It runs
It does
itself.
its own little test and you turn it on.
So you hit it's on standby, and then when you hit start.
So you put the mode when you're ready to set.
Okay. Got it.
No, the on and off switch is in the
In
back.
back.
You can turn it on, but keep it in standby. Then you can set all your parameters, and when you're ready to go, just put it in the mode that you want. And of course, you notice you have a pressure manometer here. Your alarms are pretty self-explanatory. For example, if I put my low pressure alarm all the way down as far as it'll go, the machine sometimes will start alarming because it's not set sufficiently. It's just trying to let you know that you don't have your alarm set sufficiently. It takes a few breaths for it to get around to doing that. So you want to set it based, like with all of your ventilators, on what your patient is doing. My peak inspiratory pressure here is about 25 centimeters of water. So I can set this up to, like, say, maybe about 10 or 15. I have a low power for if the battery goes out or if the electricity goes out, you're going to get the low power alarm. High pressure. Setting error. This is an alarm that you set, that you don't set this, but this, if you set something on the ventilator that's not compatible, you will get the setting error alarm. So the machine will let you know that something here is not right. Your eye time is too long or too short, or your rate or something.
What's setting error? Setting error.
Yeah, it's right here, setting error. This button is called power switch over. If you have this attached to an external battery and to your to your electrical outlet, and you unplug the outlet, it will switch over from DC to AC, or from AC to DC, but this will alarm to let you know that that switch occurred. As a practitioner, you need to know what source you're working on, whether it's plugged into the wall or whether you're working on battery.
So in the older houses, how they have like the low voltage, and you can switch to like higher electrical power?
In the
that
house?
when that you know
You can switch the house power from high to
no,
low?
you know the older houses have the lower electrical power. Will that read differently?
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Okay.
Can anybody help me out here?
I don't know.
How your
That just
voltage
lets you know
is
if you're
changed?
switching from a backup battery or to the wall.
Right.
I don't know if that's switching over from the AC/DC.
You mean when it controls the voltage?
She's
going
just
out
saying
and
if
coming
that's
in?
letting you know if you're plugged in from the
No,
wall
she
or the
knows, but
backup
she's
battery.
asking
Oh.
if in the older home and older settings, is there going to be a difference because of the voltage that's being produced out of the outlet? Is that going to be able
I
to
thought they were
control
the
that?
same regardless. I thought the house, the power that's going to your house, is that
I
what
was
you
gonna say some older houses haven't had an upgrade.
Right.
Yeah, because I know in our house is born. Our house is born. My house is, I think, in like late 50s, early 60s, and I know that we had to have everything redone
I
when we
did
put
too
the
in my
addition on
house.
our house.
Oh,
opposed
really?
To opposed to our older
I didn't
outlets.
know that.
I could ask my dad if he wants to.
So, okay,
I know
well, I
what
know
you're
back
saying,
in the
yeah,
old
like-
days, they used to have this thing called a fuse box,
Yeah.
and you had to change the fuses, but now they have the other thing that you just, circuit breaker thingy, so does that make the difference?
Would you have to check the circuit breaker to make sure there's a decent amount of voltage that goes towards that?
I'm thinking if you have the circuit breaker, there's usually a difference, because it doesn't need extra voltage anything more than anything else in your house would use.
What if we had another Sandy and then people were running on a generator?
Then that might make a difference. The generator might make a difference. It's a backup battery then. And that's why you would really have to have that backup battery in the house, just in case you do have that problem. Okay, now, if you notice my pressure manometer is going to 0 on every breath. If I want peak, I have to attach my peak valve, and as I'm turning it down, you'll notice that my peak, it doesn't go back to 0. It stops at whatever my peak pressure is. So you actually control the PEEP pressure or the PEEP externally. And you can tell what PEEP your patient is getting by looking at your pressure manometer. The other thing that you can look at your pressure manometer, okay, it doesn't like PEEP. For example, if I start to breathe spontaneously,
Is that where we're always putting the PEEP though?
I'm sorry?
That's what I thought.
Well, no, the circuit's not, just that cup, the nebulizing.
No, there's no, we just have the nebulizer attached so that we have a closed system. We don't have to have it, we're not
Right.
giving the treatment through there or anything.
So it would just be a continuous tube with that port for the PEEP valve.
Right.
Like a elbow or
It actually
whatever.
says expiratory, or actually, your expiratory is just on your expiratory limb here. Remember this old external circuit? This is your expiratory valve and flow, and it's attached to your machine here where it actually says exhalation valve. So your exhalation valve is also external. So flow comes through here, closes the exhalation valve when a patient is delivered, when a breath is delivered, and then when it's time for the patient to exhale, that valve opens and you exhale to the
It's
atmosphere.
like the diaphragm.
Yeah.
The diaphragm, exactly.
Okay, it's coming back.
And this is your expiratory limb here. There's no expiratory part of the circuit. It goes to the atmosphere.
Oh, right, okay.
Okay? Everybody?
Makes sense.
So when you're going to put a PEEP valve on, since there's nothing internally that you can set PEEP, you have to actually put a PEEP valve on the expiratory limb of your circuit. And then that gives you your PEEP. And what I was also showing you before that was when the patient is breathing spontaneously, you see the little light come on down here where it says breathing effort?
Uh-huh.
It's telling you that your patient is taking spontaneous breath.
Take spontaneous breath.
Huh?
Was it a spontaneous breath on there? Oh, the green light flashes.
Breathing
You
effort.
didn't see it? It's easy to do without this thing. Maybe if I can make it a little more sensitive.
Can you pull it closer?
See the light?
Oh, we.
Oh, yeah,
Everybody
yeah,
knows
okay.
how I hear you talking.
Got it?
That's spontaneous breathing, right?
Yeah.
I laugh every time. Can you still see it in there? Yep.
And of course, these two things would like, for example, as I said, it does have an internal battery. If we were working off the internal battery, or if you're working off that external battery that we talked about, then this would light up to let you know which one you're on. As you know, we're plugged into the wall, so these things aren't on at all. Be quiet. And of course, everybody's favorite button, the alarm silence.
Where is that? Right
The
there. Oh, I
alarm
see
silence
it.
right here.
Okay. Battery test.
Thank you. And of course, you can get this battery to test, to test the battery to see if you have power on your battery. Now, you can do pressure control with these devices. The pressure control has to be set using this knob over here where it says pressure. In other words, with volume control, as long as you're setting all of those parameters there, you're in volume control. If you want to go up to pressure control, then you need to get an occluded pressure by occluding it, and a power and a breath, and this is one of those push-in knobs where it doesn't just turn on its own. You gotta like push it in and turn it, and that will set your pressure if you're gonna use pressure ventilation. Very rarely on an adult patient are you gonna see pressure ventilation in the home. It's usually volume ventilation. But they did include that because, you know, it may, on those rare occasions, it may happen.
So you would unhook it from,
Occlude it,
and then you
turn,
said
push this knob in and turn it.
Which does what?
gives it a
and
breath. You said.
No, it just actually allows you to set peak pressure, so for pressure ventilation.
Okay.
It's not a pressure, here you're setting your pressure limit for volume ventilation. By using this button, you're in pressure control, and that sets your pressure for pressure control
It's
ventilation.
moving that line
Right.
on the blue, right?
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
It's moving the line on the blue.
It's moving a line on the...
On the patient pressure.
Oh, the pressure, yeah.
Yeah.
And you can't do that unless you occlude it.
Right, you want to occlude
Occlude it, set
You
it.
always want to set an occluded pressure when you're doing pressure ventilation, and then you want to check to see what your volumes are once you get your patient attached and make sure your volumes are adequate. If your volumes aren't adequate, just like with any other ventilator, you have to adjust your pressure to get the adequate volume to ventilate your patient. but mostly you're just going to set your volume ventilation. And there's very little more than that. Everything is E about this machine is in Mosby's. There's not a lot you have to do with it. The checkup itself is just being able to set it up, hook it to the lawn, put in your parameters, and just know some of the basic things about
You
how
can't
it
give a
works.
manual breath or anything, can you?
You probably can. I've never tried. No, you can't.
Because it's just that.
Yeah.
So you can't actually check the delivered tidal volume. There's no thing that's reading it.
There's no right respirometer or anything. You'd have to put a right in line. Just like when we did IPPB, you had to put a right in line.
Yep.
Now you set your tidal volume.
So you don't know if
You can
it's
read your
accurate.
pressure, but you can't read your volume.
I don't understand the occluding part.
You can't understand what part?
The-
You always want to get an occluded pressure.
Okay, so can you just do that again? When you
So that's the
included it, where did
maximum
it go?
pressure that's gonna reach in,
It didn't go anywhere. It's
Yeah,
going to
that's
this
why.
machine to do the reading internally.
I know, I want to see, no, the blue part.
You want to get an occluded pressure. Now, right now, I have my pressure limit set, so if I get rid of that,
that's how you set the maximum pressure.
and now if I start turning this down, because I want to set my patient on pressure control, I want to set the pressure limit that I want them to get in pressure control ventilation. And I have it turned all the way up. And again, when we start looking at infants, you're going to see that again. You're going to get that occluded pressure.
So as you turn it down with every breath, that should get smaller,
It should.
the line.
Come on, get a breath. Okay, now it's not giving me anything. I turned it down too low.
Well, you're
also see-
disconnected.
Huh?
You're disconnected. So somebody that would be back in the day on this.
No, this is what you would set up in somebody's home.
Yeah, but I know. Well, there's a lot of newer things now that are like ventilator-wise that are
Uh-huh.
more, almost like a. It's like almost like a. We have it's almost like a ventilator on. It's like a ventilator
Like
set up exactly at home. Yeah, like the Trilogy. But what I'm saying is that you really would need like round the clock. Like someone, they're still. Why would real quick? Why were you sending somebody home though like this?
Like, oh, the ventilator?
On a, because they're on a, if they have a tracheostomy, if they're still
You
a
mean, why would you
trach
send them home on a
patient.
ventilator?
Yeah, I mean, if they're that sick, should they be in the
No,
hospital?
there are people who
Just need it to
just
live.
need to, they can't breathe. Let's say you have a paralyzed diaphragm, or a patient who has like a Lou Gehrig's disease, or muscular dystrophy. Their ventilatory muscles are paralyzed. Other than that, they're fine. They don't need to be in a hospital because
No. I know. I understand because that's what I'm saying. Like the Trilogy, that what I'm thinking about, it's the same. It's the same thing that they do now. It's like I said, the setup of the screen looks just like a ventilator that you see in the hospital. So it's monitoring more things. What I'm saying is, so someone who goes home like this, they are still round the clock care because
right.
so
Normally they have
you're still
a-
kind of like whether you're. I mean, I understand it's not safe to be in the
That's
hospital,
why
but you're not really.
That's why they need a round-the-clock caregiver, not necessarily a nurse. You have home care PCAs,
No, but to monitor
home
the
care
tidal
nursing aides.
volume, to
But
monitor.
the therapist, the home care company, has to send somebody to their home on a regular basis to make sure everything is functioning and to double check all of the parameters and make sure they're getting what's set.
And then that's where you also said you would educate the caregiver.
You must
also.
educate the caregiver, whether that person is a nurse or not. The primary caregiver, their wife, their child, their husband, whatever, must be educated as to how this equipment works. Absolutely.
How often would they have someone come to the house? Every day?
I usually, from the home care company, they set up like maybe a weekly visit, but you might have a home health nurse or that comes every day. My husband had a home health nurse that came every day, but he was on dialysis and he was blind. So we had a nurse that came to the house. Well, she wasn't a nurse; she was a nurse's aide. But she'd come every day to make sure, because I work, so to make sure he was taken care of and make sure he was eating properly and just change his bandages if he had any, stuff like that.
Right.
Okay. Like I said, this is very simplistic. It's very self-explanatory. We're not going to go crazy with this check off.
Good.